All right, it's 7 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and get started here. First of all, thank you for attending our fall Suffolk webinar. Tonight we have Philip Berg, longtime Suffolk producer, as well as an instructor at the Pipestone Lamb and Wool program. He's going to be speaking with us about enterprise analysis and benchmarking. If you do have questions, feel free to ask those throughout the presentation. You can either use the question and answer box if you're on Zoom or the chat feature on Zoom. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, feel free to type those questions in the comments and I'll feed all of those questions to Philip throughout the presentation. With that, I'll let Philip go ahead and get started.
Thank you very much, Amanda. It's a pleasure to speak tonight on this topic. Just a little background, I think this webinar was requested after the Lamb Summit last August, where one of the key emphasis was knowing our production and economic records or financial records. And so I think that was a big outcome of that, and was happy to help out in this way. Today, I think also more than ever, sheep producers need to have a plan, keep and use their records and monitor their progress. We cannot manage anything that we do not measure, and so obviously that's an important emphasis or an important part of this presentation. So my goal is for you to help give you an understanding of the enterprise analysis, and hopefully that will encourage you to complete an enterprise analysis for your operation so you can make better decisions. I would also like to credit a few people, some past lamb and wool instructors, for their contributions to the work that was done in enterprise analysis within our program. Specifically reaching out and thanking Dean Risa, Mike Caskey, and Lori Johnson for all that they've helped to contribute to the lamb and wool program, and specifically the enterprise analysis work that we do here or have done here, as well as our current instructor, our new instructor, and Coltar. So the first thing I wanted to emphasize is that we need to have some kind of goal or mission. This is something that we need to get down in writing for our operations, so that our partners, whether that be other family members or lenders, some of the other people that we work with, have an understanding of where we're going and what, why are we raising sheep, what are the products that we're raising, who are our customers, and consequently or ultimately, what are our key measures. It is really interesting to me that over 90% of the sheep producers in the United States have less than 100 ewes, and only about a third of the total ewe flock base. And so we have a lot of variety of people or ways to be economical in the sheep industry, many different ways that we are emphasis of why we are raising sheep, primarily for meat and wool production, but also breeding stock, club lambs, weed control, fire prevention are also some other ways that we might want to be raising sheep. Because we have so many different key measures, depending on why you're raising sheep, I'm going to focus more on what is important to the producers that I work with, and talk a little bit about the key measures that are important to them. And so most of the presentation from the rest of the way out is going to focus on that and kind of Midwestern sheep production. That doesn't mean that a lot of these areas or key measures would not also be important to other sheep production systems, and many would be, but I'm going to focus in on the measures that are probably important to the members that I'm working with. Because of that, I need to tell you a little bit about our production system, and it starts off, and these are kind of the key factors that are important to our production system. One is it's a controlled production system. Is that we take control of our production system, knowing when we turn rams out, when we pull rams, so that we know when they'll lamb, um, is very important for us. And knowing how many ewes are lambing at each different time period. So the controlled production system, controlling that becomes very important to us. Efficient housing and low labor systems also are very important. Uh, the Pipestone Lamb and Wool program was established in the early 1970s, and basically from day one, labor was a very important part of it, and it still is today. Is that how do we run more sheep with the same or less labor? And so low labor systems, efficient housing becomes very important. And for us to function that way, controlled production is a key component of that as well. We also need to have our preventative health program so that we reduce or minimize our health risks. Ultimately, our producers are taking their production and economic records and trying to make a balance in terms of the production and economics of sheep production. And that's where our enterprise analysis comes into place. So what are some of the key measures that we look at in our production system with the Pipestone Lamb and Wool program? And those key measures begin with conception rate. And that's important for us. If we don't have ewes that get bred or a high conception rate, that's going to negatively impact the economics of our operation. And so our target is about 95%. And I need to step back is that early on, the members of our Pipestone Lamb and Wool program requested that these benchmarks be established to return about a $40 net return per ewe. And, and so annually we put this together based on the most current information that we have, and that's where these benchmarks come from. Now we have many producers that are targeting a much higher net return than that, and our top third of our producers that send in enterprise analysis are probably in excess of $100 return per ewe. But that means that they're doing a better job of meeting or exceeding these key measures. And so our starting point is what we call our formula for profit, looks at these key measurement factors. And so conception rate is at the top, 95%, and that's something that we've been very close to over the years. But definitely brings up a red flag if somebody sends in their enterprise analysis and we end up with an 80% conception or lower, is that that's a red flag for us. And then we can address that specifically to try to improve that or eliminate that risk of happening again. So again, conception rate at 95%, lambing percentage is marketed and or retained is at about 170%. Pounds of lamb marketed per ewe is just under 200 pounds. Lamb feed efficiency, we're targeting our feed efficiency around 3.4 to 1. We're pushing our lambs. Most of those lambs are reaching market at about 5 to 6 months of age. And so, and that fits into our marketing plan as well. Feed efficiency would be, for some, might also be looked at as a feed cost. The lamb feed cost is another way of looking at that, but we monitor lamb feed efficiency very closely. How many pounds of feed does it take us to get to a market-ready lamb is the way we're calculating that. Ewe and ram feed cost is very important and obviously takes up a big chunk of our expense of raising our sheep. And so that's something that we have many producers that wake up every morning and look at ways to feed their ewes cheaper without compromising any performance. And so again, that's a very important factor. The direct expenses and depreciated expenses we try to keep under $100. This becomes very difficult for those flocks that are just beginning. But for more established flocks, we obtain that pretty consistently. Um, but those are our target measures that we're shooting for. And for your operation, you might have a different list of key measures, but a lot of these key measures are going to be important in most of your operations. And so, again, this is kind of our starting point, and it was driven by the program members that we work with, that they're looking for a target net return of $40 per U. And again, most are shooting for a much higher level than that, but that's where we're starting from. So what tools do we have available to help us to, to measure those key factors? Um, and it all starts with our lambing barn records. Our lambing barn records, and I'm convinced that everybody online keeps some kind of lambing barn records. The goal out of this presentation might be is that we need to bring those lambing barn records to life a little bit. How do we utilize those records to enhance our production? How do we utilize those records to measure our progress? And if we adapt a new technology or a new management strategy, how do we measure that with our barn records? But barn records, uh, most people keep barn records, and I think that's great. The goal, though, is that we need to bring them to life. Health records is another component. I think it's going to be an area that we're going to spend more time in. Keeping records, I think there's two components to that. Antibiotic use is one, but also what kind of preventative health uh, programs do we have in place? When do we um, when do we vaccinate our lambs? When do we vaccinate ewes? Um, those are very important records that we need to keep track of. Um, we've got producers, many of our producers, by the time when they ewes are lambing, they're writing on their calendar when they're going to wean their lambs and when they're going to process those lambs, when they're going to vaccinate those lambs, so that they have records of when that needs to be done, rather than thinking about, oh gosh, it's about time that we vaccinate our lambs. That is preventative health record that we're trying to keep track of. Marketing and production information is also a measurement tool. We keep a lot of the marketing information, and the quality of the lamb that we're delivering, or the quality of wool that we're delivering, is a measure that we can use in our enterprise analysis as well. The financial side of it is just the dollars and cents in terms of what we need to collect from our sheep operation, how we collect that information in a usable format that we can use to put into our enterprise analysis and ultimately evaluate our operation. When we think about this, these are key measures. We're not always looking for maximum production. Um, we're looking for more optimum production. And it's very easy to incorporate um, additional inputs or technology for maximum production. We can provide more feed, more um, more facilities, um, provide more labor. All those things come at a cost, um, and and we want to look at it. And this diagram on the left of the screen kind of looks at genetics, nutrition, all of the inputs into our operation, and how they need to be in balance. If we build more buildings or have more labor, obviously that has an impact on other parts of our operation. If we identify better genetics to produce more lambs, how does that influence our nutritional program? How does that influence our facilities? And so all those things are tied together, and it's important for us to look at that as a moving entity. Is that when we pull one way, that's going to have an impact on another component of our operation. And so we're looking at optimum production, and how does the new technology, or does the new input, does the new RAM that we purchased actually helping our operation? And so through enterprise analysis, that helps us to evaluate those different changes. again, if we don't have that information collected, we don't know where we're at, and we don't know how that technology or that genetics changed our operation. Was that economical for us or not? And so again, it's more of an optimum production that we're targeting and going after. To further look at the enterprise analysis, the most important part of it is an individual analysis, which shows the different trends from year to year and shows the differences in our production system or in our operation when we do implement something different or we manage something different. And so that helps us to manage that technology or input change, and we can look from year to year in terms of some trends that we're seeing. And if we're starting to see some production measures, whether it's a health issue or a growth issue, we can capitalize on that and help to go back into our operations and fine tune it to enhance or make us more profitable. The other component and for that we use the enterprise analysis for is a benchmarking tool, is to help us to determine, gosh, am I in the ballpark of our production system, whether that's from a cost standpoint or from a production standpoint. Am I in the ballpark? And that helps us to throw up red flags. And so when we share our enterprise analysis with our members, they're looking back at their individual performance and say, gosh, you know what, I could do better here. And it also gives reassurance that there are people that are doing a higher level of performance. And so it's a nice tool from a benchmarking standpoint that we can use for everybody. But ultimately, to me, the most important tool is that for you to use it to monitor your progress and to evaluate changes in your operation. So to start with, I'm going to just kind of go through some of the input that we put into the enterprise analysis, and also I'm going to go in, then I'm going to follow that with some of the summary information that we've had over the last 3 years. And so income is something that's important for an enterprise analysis to help us determine where we're at, where we've been, where we're trying to go to. And this is an area that probably is pretty easy to get the information on. Most people keep very good track of this for their taxes as well. But what kind of income are we getting on our market lambs, feeder lambs, breeding stock that we might sell, culls, cull ewes, or cull rams, our wool, and we break that down between wool from our ewes and from our lambs. Wool incentive, which is available now for at this point, and other miscellaneous income. We've had people that have other byproducts that have included that as other forms of income that go into that. And again, this is an area that usually is pretty easily obtained information because we're keeping track of that. The better job we do in terms of the number of head, as well as the pounds and dollars that we allocate to that, the more information that we're going to get back in our enterprise analysis as well. Purchases is another area that really we get a lot of. It's pretty easy to obtain because it's usually smaller numbers of purchases, and it's something that we keep track of, again, for many times for our taxes. And so how many head, pounds, and dollars, again, in both rams and ewes in terms of our purchases of our breeding stock. Okay, so when we look at our benchmarking for the last 3 years of income, this is what shows up for the years 17, 18, and 19. This is broken down into each bar graph includes the lamb sales, the cull sales, the wool sales, and miscellaneous. And so when we look at that, based on our enterprise analysis, we receive around $260 worth of income from our lambs, and we're receiving about $10 to $15 for our culls and our wool production combined. And so based on our enterprise analysis, about 94% of our income is coming from the sale of lambs. And so that's why many times you hear us talking about our lambs and our performance on our lambs and feeding our lambs and taking them to growing efficiently to heavier weights in terms of a quality lamb. That is very important to us because that's most of our sales. Um, our wool sales is only about 2% of our income, and so that obviously has a lower priority. That doesn't mean that we try to do a poor job of putting our wool up. That just means that we're putting more of our emphasis on our lamb and our lamb production. Now, some of you that have I've talked to a producer that sells their wool for $10 a pound, and they get 15 to 20 pounds of wool per ewe. So in their operation, obviously wool is going to be a much larger component. But for us here in the Midwest, that's kind of the breakdown that we're dealing with. If I looked at our top 30% of our producers, they probably have incomes that are going to be over $300. And so again, this is our enterprise analysis. This is a summary based on 17, 18, and 19 um, for the members that we're working with. When we look at excuse me, when we look at feed costs, that's another input that's very important. And again, uh, is probably a little harder to come by than some of our income or purchases because many of our producers are raising a lot of their own feedstuffs and purchasing some of their feedstuffs. They might have multiple enterprises, whether they might have beef cattle as well as their sheep or goats. And so allocation of feedstuffs sometimes becomes difficult between enterprises, whether that's a cropping enterprise, forage enterprise, or a beef enterprise and a sheep enterprise. Allocation of those costs becomes a little bit more difficult. I encourage producers to jump in when they start doing this. The first time you do it, you're probably not going to be 100%, but each year that you do this and enter information, the more accurate your information is going to be, and you're going to do a better job with it. The other thing that we like to do is we separate it based on our ewes and rams feed costs versus our lamb feed costs, and we basically are looking at them as kind of two different enterprises as well when we look at our feed costs standpoint. And so we're allocating our forages to our ewes and our rams versus our lambs. The same way with our grain sources, our salt, pasture, complete rations, or supplemental pellets. If we're buying all of our feedstuffs, this becomes pretty easy because we have a record of those purchases, and so that works out a little bit easier. But for most of the operations that we work with, this is one of the more challenging areas of the enterprise analysis. The other thing is that when we are raising our own feedstuffs, we need to put a fair market value on those so that we're allocating those appropriately so that our sheep enterprise is paying for itself compared to our haying enterprise or our grain enterprise. And so we try to use a fair market price when we're using those prices. So when we look at our enterprise analysis, and I went back a few more years, and I'm missing a few years, I couldn't find a few of those years. And on here, I've got two bars or two colors to this bar. The bottom bar is our ewe and ram feed costs, and the top bar is just our lamb feed cost per ewe. And so if we have more lambs per ewe, obviously it's going to be more expensive than just one ewe or one lamb feed cost. And so when we look at that, we're running on our ewe and ram costs around $80. The last few years are just over $80. Our top third of our producers probably have an annual ewe feed cost of about $67 for last year. But on an average, for our program members, we're probably closer to that $80, and that's kind of where we targeted based on our benchmarks as well. The feed cost for the lambs is going to run around $76. is where that's kind of fitting in there. And again, that's going to vary. If we do a better job of keeping more lambs alive and getting more lambs born, that number is going to be higher simply because we're feeding more lambs. Another area for our enterprise analysis that we're looking at is our direct costs. And again, some of these direct costs are going to be more easily found than others. And depends on how many other enterprises you might have. If sheep are your only enterprise, obviously this will be easier to come by. If we have multiple enterprises, allocating some of our repairs and maintenance, some of our trucking, some of our insurance, our utilities, our hired labor, some of our building rentals, gas and fuel, grease and oil, those are going to have to be allocated. And again, when we're doing this the first time, I encourage producers to jump in, put some numbers down. Many times we're using the percentage for those costs. For some of those, like utilities, we might be using a certain percentage, and we can fluctuate our enterprises quite a bit unless it truly has changed, unless we had a cattle and a sheep operation and we're using that same feed wagon to feed both of them, and then we sell all the cattle. Obviously then the sheep are going to have to increase their percentage, or if we increased greatly our sheep operation, we might need to increase some of those percentages, but try to keep them somewhat constant after the first couple of years that you develop them. This is an important thing, and obviously we use a lot of these records as well for our taxes, but just allocating the different enterprises can be difficult at times, but we need to just jump in and get started on them and start getting some numbers. Every year that we do it again, it's going to be easier for us to obtain better records. When we look at direct expenses, again, I reached out over a longer time period, and one of the things that we've been tracking is this direct expense, and this is something that we watch as closely as we can. I've got two bars in here. Kind of the lighter colored bar is our actual enterprise analysis of the information that I found, and then the darker colored bar is it's called FinBen, or it's information that came from the FinPack program that we have here in Minnesota. It's a farm financial program, and so they're basically showing the same thing. The FinBen numbers are higher than what our numbers are, but they're really showing a very similar trend, increasing trend, where we're seeing about a 5% annual increase in these expenses. And this is something that we have to account for when we're looking at our enterprises, is that if all of our other expenses and our production systems stay the same, our direct expenses are still increasing basically at a 5% rate. And so when that's happening, that means for us to return as much dollars per ewe, we need to be more productive, or we need to be more efficient in another area. I'm not sure that we can try to watch our costs as much as we can, but this is a pattern that this trend is going upward, and I think it's going to be harder for us to minimize those costs much more than that 5% increase that we're seeing from year to year. And so again, this is important. It's an important part of our enterprise analysis, and just wanted to pass that on as well. The last inputs that we put into our enterprise analysis are performance measures, and these are the measures that, in terms of our lambs and what we have born, how many ewes we have, how many ewes we expose, how many lambs we wean, how many lambs we market, how many lambs we retain, and then also looking at the losses in terms of ewe loss into ram losses or lambs, and we break the lamb losses down from birth to weaning and from weaning to market. And so these are the measures. I would say the places that we have the most difficulty is in our number of ewes that we expose. That's an area that we need to write down. If we don't write down, sometimes we forget about that number. Um, but but that's an area that we really need to. How many ewes did we truly expose, and how many did we lamb? And we can backtrack that based on how many ewes you sell as open ewes. But obviously, that number of ewes exposed is an important number because we make a lot of production calculations based on the number of ewes exposed, and that has an impact on our operation. The other area that we struggle sometimes with in collecting some of the information, or the harder areas, is our death loss and keeping those recorded. And again, a lot of that information can be found on our barn record cards and our marketing cards. The other part of our enterprise analysis, and I'm not going to share it with you as much, is that we do have a checks and balance that kind of shows our ins and outs of our lambs and our ewes. And if we don't come out the same in terms of how many sheep we started with and how many sheep we had born, and then how many sheep we sold in our ending inventory, it kind of throws a red flag up if we're off by very many in terms of we're not accounting for all those animals. And so it's kind of a total flock reporting system in place. And so these performance measures will help us measure some of the other benchmarks that I'm going to share with you next. And so kind of the rest of this presentation is going to talk about some of our other performance benchmarks that we measure, and hopefully stimulate you to, or encourage you to get your own enterprise analysis and see where you fit. So the first one we talked about is our conception rate. And I apologize, I didn't have two bars on each year, 17, 18, and 19. The lighter colored bar is our bar for our mature ewes. And we exposed all of our ewe lambs to lamb at about 13 months of age. And they are going to be the darker blue bar that is next to it. And again, we use this as an individual. If this was our individual performance, we're looking at, okay, we must have made some kind of a management change to increase our conception rate, whether that was a nutritional input that we used or something on a management level that we changed. But we saw some improvements there, and especially we saw some improvements in our replacement ewe lambs from 17, 18, and 19. And so that's the way that we would be using that as a benchmarking tool. If I'd be looking at a mature ewes, we're somewhere around 94 to 95% year in and year out on our mature ewes. We have flocks that are 96%. Ewe lambs, we're probably closer to the 85 to 90% on our ewe lambs in terms of our year in and year out on our ewe lambs. When we get below that 85%, that kind of throws up a red flag on our ewe lambs, and we need to go back and look at our operation and what can we do to increase that conception rate. If I looked at our top third of our producers, we're probably, and overall, we're probably on a flock basis, ewe lambs and mature ewes, right at that 93%. Percent lamb crops born. Again, this is based on both on a per ewe exposed basis and a per ewe lambing basis. So the first bar, the lighter colored bar, is on a per ewe exposed basis. The darker bar is on a per ewe lambing basis. And so on a per ewe lambing exposed basis, those numbers, because we're exposing more, our open ewes are accounted for in that, so that number is going to be lower than our per ewe lambing basis. When we look at the percent lamb crop overall, we're approaching that 200% lamb crop. What holds us back probably is our ewe lambs lambing, and that when we have 17% of our flock coming in as ewe lambs that holds us back. If we would look at strictly our mature ewes, many of our producers are going to be in excess of the 200% lamb crops that are being born. Interesting, the last 3 years we're seeing that increase. When we look at percent lambs weaned, um, again, the two bars in there on per ewe exposed basis and a per ewe lambing basis. We're hovering around that 160%. Last year we were probably around 170% of our lambs being marketed, or excuse me, being weaned. When we look at the percent lambs marketed and or retained, again with the per ewe exposed basis on a per ewe lambing basis, we're right around that 140 to 150% of our lambs being marketed and or retained in the last 3 years. And we see some fluctuations. And again, this is an area that we can use as a benchmark to say, okay, where are we at? And if this was our individual operation, what things can we do? We slipped up a little bit from 18. What things can we do to help us advance? Average weight of lambs marketed, or excuse me, average weight of lambs, market lambs sold, and our average went down a little bit this last year, but we've been hovering around that 132 pounds, and that's been a fairly constant number. Not exactly sure why that went down a little bit in 19, but we did see that on the people that submitted their enterprise analysis. And so this helps us as a tool when we're trying to set up the benchmark or our key measurements, is knowing what product or what size product we're ended up selling, because that will have an impact on the total economics of our operation. When we look at a price per hundredweight of culls sold, I just put this up there. This is something that we look at, and for the years that I can find the data on, we were in the 20s and 30 cents in the early 2000 years, and now it's interesting, and Ann told me today that I should include 2020 because that probably would go off my chart. But obviously, 17, 18, and 19, we're seeing a much higher cull price for our culls being sold, and so that's a very favorable thing. When we look at our average weight of our culls being sold, that has increased from 152 pounds roughly to 160 pounds. So we've increased that about 8 pounds. And so our producers are trying to capitalize on that added, of the ewes that we're culling, we're not necessarily trying to cull more, but when we do identify a cull, we want to increase the value of that cull. And since the prices have been going up, we're trying to take advantage of that. And I think that's what this is helping us to show. When we look at pounds of lamb marketed per ewe and per ewe exposed basis, we're in that $150 to $160 range is where we've been in the last 3 years. Our target is probably higher than that, and so that's an area that we need to focus on. I'm anticipating that the year 2020 we're going to have of higher numbers in here because we've had better success in our lamb crops, and we're probably taking lambs to a little heavier weights. And so I anticipate that to be a little bit higher. But on average, the last 3 years, if I'd average the last 3 years, we'd be in that 150 to 160 pound range. Death loss is something that is very important and obvious. It is very important, and even without doing your enterprise analysis, I think that's something that you could look at and count up fairly easily and quickly. I've got 3 different bar graphs here. The first one, the lightest colored one, the shortest one, is on our ewes, and it was interesting. We had someone speak to our group, and they talked a little bit about facilities, and they got sidetracked a little bit and talked about ewe death loss and concern and how that affected facilities a little bit and how they manage their sheep operation. And they asked the question, okay, what's a typical ewe death loss? And on our enterprise analysis, we're around that 4 to 5% is a typical or a benchmark. Obviously, we have people that are better than that, and some that are probably worse than that, and we would like to be better than that. But our enterprise analysis or the benchmark to that is around that 4 to 5%. The area that the last couple of years, and we're going to continue to work on is lambs and keeping lambs alive. Lambs from the next middle bar is our lambs to weaning, and the far right bar, the brighter blue bar, is lambs to market. Typically, our lambs to market is a smaller percentage than our lambs to weaning. And really, when we identify and even look at our records even closer, the first few days of life is probably where we see our highest lamb death loss. And so we're looking at this and constantly looking at this. And I think this is going to be a growing area, especially as some of our consumers are asking for antibiotic free. And we're moving that direction and trying to accommodate that, but that's also has an implication on this chart. And so that's something that we're watching and looking at closely, and we're trying to fine tune and trying to identify ways to minimize some of our health risks that we have in terms of a preventative health protocol. But again, this is where we're at from a benchmark standpoint. Individually, we can look at that and target more specific health protocols or strategies on an individual basis. Feed efficiencies is an area that we focus in on greatly. We're predominantly a high energy grain based diet for our lambs, and so this feed efficiency is very important for us. And we're targeting about around 3.4 pounds of feed to reach a market weight of 132 pounds. And so if I calculate that out, that's going to be about 425 to 450 pounds of feed that we're putting into those lambs prior to going to market. And so feed efficiency is very important. You know, if you're not looking at as much at feed efficiency, the feed cost on your lambs, I mean, basically that's what this equates to, is our feed cost per lamb, is that looking at our feed cost per lamb is very important as well. And so to me, they complement each other. At least this is our measure of our lamb feed costs, because we're feeding our lambs all the same. And so the more efficient that they are, the cheaper our feed cost is going to be. And so that's why we focus in on this feed efficiency and monitor and try to enhance our production and management systems so that we maximize our feed efficiency. And so what goes into that is our feed ingredients, our management in terms of how we're managing the feed, how we're managing our lambs as they grow to maximize this feed efficiency, to maximize their intakes so that they grow more efficiently. So that's a very important table for us. When we look at pounds of wool sold, again, we're right around the 7 pounds that we sell annually on our wool. And so obviously we look at that and the costs that are associated with that, and we want to do a good job with this, but also we also realize that our lamb is probably has our bigger income draw based on our production system. So kind of bringing us back to the benchmarks, these are kind of the benchmarks that we're using. And again, many of you should have very similar benchmarks. You might have some differences here in terms of your benchmarks, in terms of what your revenue source is. And if it's higher emphasis on wool, your pounds of lamb marketed maybe doesn't need to be quite as high. But these are kind of the benchmarks that we're shooting for. Again, a 95% conception rate. Our lambing percentage marketed and or retained close to that 170%. we have a 17% replacement rate. So that means that we need to be marketing about 1.5 lambs per ewe um, to obtain that. And we need to be marketing about 192 pounds of lamb per ewe exposed. Um, and so those things are very, very important. That also brings in our feed cost of our lamb feed efficiency of 3.45, or we're looking at a feed cost around that 45 to $50 for our feed cost, or a feed efficiency of 3.45 to 1, taking 3.45 pounds of feed for every pound that we put on that lamb. Annual ewe feed costs and direct and non-direct costs, those are dollar for dollar. If we can cheapen those up by $5, that means that we return $5 more per head. If we can cheapen up our direct or non-direct costs or our depreciated items by $5, that means that we're going to return $5 more to our operation and per head. And so those are big things, big numbers to us. And so again, these are benchmarks, and these are the benchmarks that we're using for our operation and for our production system here. And very important. And you need to identify your benchmarks that are important to you. So in summary, you need to develop a plan, and it needs to be written down so that your partners, your business partners, whether that's your banker, whether that's your employees, whether that's your family members, they know the plan, they know the goals that we're shooting for. And then we can utilize those records to monitor that plan or those goals to see where we're at and track that progress. And so first off, we need to just jump in, get started. We need to start collecting some of these numbers and doing it. Many times our producers have this information. It's just taking the time. We need to take the time to write that information down. Important to get it wrote down and to analyze it. With that, I am done. And if there are any questions, I would be happy to answer them.
Okay, great. We'll give a little time here for questions to come in. Again, if you are joining us via Zoom, use the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen or the chat window. Either one of those works. If you are on Facebook, there is a little bit of delay, so it might be a little bit till we get some questions off of Facebook. But you can go ahead and comment in the comment section on the video, and I will share those with Philip as well. While we're kind of waiting to see if anybody has any questions, I will let everybody know that this webinar is going to be archived on our website, suffolks.org. That will happen sometime tomorrow. So watch for that link posted on our website, again, suffolks.org. It'll also be on our Facebook page as well. Okay, looks like we got a question that came in here. What breeds is the analysis results based on?
Well, great question, Gene. The predominant breeds that we use are kind of a Western base, so Rambouillet and Targhee, and then we influence it with some Dorset and some Finn, and so those would be the three primary breeds that go in there, and those are the primary breeds. And so it's a polypay type ewe, and usually we're using terminal sires, fast growing terminal sires to produce our market lambs. And so the base ewe flock is from a polypay type, which is kind of a Western ewe with some Finn Dorset in him, and polypay type. And then we're using our terminal rams, fast growing terminal rams, as a terminal sire. So.
Thanks. Another question would be, are there any types of like documents or papers that individuals who are following this could use as a starting point for their own enterprise analysis?
Yeah, there are some places, and I just searched sheep enterprise analysis on the web, and there was a couple of places that came up. Colorado has Colorado has the had a pretty good paper there that talked a lot extensively about enterprise analysis and collecting the information, but there were other sources there as well. There was a couple of budgets that were out there as well. So if you type in sheep enterprise budgets, you would find some of those as well. Sometimes that's a good starting point. And again, the Colorado one probably would be the one that I would direct people to. So.
Okay, great. Thank you. Anyone else have any questions? Give just a little bit here to see if anybody else thinks it's something they want to feed in. One thing I will do is I will put Philip's contact information when we archive the webinar. So if you do have any questions for him specifically or about the Pipestone Lamb and Wool program, you'll have that information that you can get in contact with him. I do not see any other questions that have come in either way. So I think we will conclude. Thank you so much for your time, Philip. We had a great audience on Zoom as well as Facebook. So again, for anyone who wants to go back and review, this webinar will be archived at suffolks.org tomorrow. Thank you very much, Philip.
Have a nice evening, everybody.
Yep, thank you.